There are certain things I do without thinking anymore. I set the coffee maker the night before. I fold the dish towels in thirds instead of halves because Ethan finds it neater. I remember to move his dry cleaning to the passenger seat so he doesn't forget it on his way to the office. 20 years of marriage leaves its marks in small, invisible ways. That Saturday morning started the same as every year. The Reynolds family barbecue. Ethan's birthday weekend. A backyard full of people who had, somewhere along the way, become the only extended family I knew. I was standing at the kitchen counter working on the potato salad, the one Margaret taught me to make the summer after we got engaged, when Ethan came in from the back porch, phone in hand, still half smiling at whatever conversation he'd just finished. "That was Amanda," he said. "She's glad you're coming this year." I kept stirring. Why wouldn't I be coming? He set the phone down on the counter and reached past me for his coffee mug the way he always does, easy and comfortable. "She said Mom mentioned you usually stay home, that you don't really enjoy being around the family." I stopped, not dramatically. I didn't put the spoon down or turn to look at him. I just stopped, the way you do when something doesn't quite compute and your brain needs an extra second to catch up. You usually stay home. I thought about the past 20 years, every Thanksgiving, every Christmas Eve. Every birthday party, graduation, and anniversary dinner I had shown up for, sometimes when Ethan couldn't, sometimes when I had worked a double shift the night before and driven an hour on 4 hours of sleep to be there on time. I had set up folding tables in Daniel's garage. I had washed dishes at Margaret's house while everyone else moved to the living room. I had remembered Aunt Carol's food allergies before the family potlucks. I had bought birthday gifts for nieces and nephews whose names took me 2 years to memorize because they came into the family so quickly. Not one of those years had I stayed home. Not one. Ethan was already moving to the refrigerator. "You know how Mom is," he said. "She probably just meant you seemed tired at these things." And just like that, the conversation was over. That's the thing about living with someone who genuinely believes peace is the same as resolution. Ethan wasn't dismissing me because he didn't care. He was dismissing me because, in his mind, he had already solved the problem by softening it. I let it go, like I always did. But I brought the potato salad, and I brought the vegetable platter, and I drove to Daniel's house knowing something had quietly shifted inside me, even if I couldn't name it yet. The barbecue was ordinary in all the ways those gatherings tend to be. Children running through the sprinklers, someone's husband arguing good-naturedly about the best way to grill a burger. Margaret in a pale yellow blouse, carrying a pie she'd made from scratch, moving through the backyard the way she always did. Comfortable, unhurried, already the center of every conversation before anyone noticed she'd arrived. She hugged me at the door. "I was hoping you'd feel up to coming," she said. I smiled. Of course. That's all it was, a small sentence. The kind that sounds like warmth if you aren't listening carefully. I'd heard it before, I realized, phrased 100 different ways over the years. "I didn't think you'd want to stay for dessert. I figured you were probably tired." I told them not to expect you. Small sentences, gentle voices, each one just believable enough that I'd accepted it without question. I found Amanda near the drink table. She's always been kind to me, warm in that easy, unguarded way some people are, and when she saw me, she crossed the yard with her arms open. "I'm really glad you came," she said, and I could tell she meant it. "I come every year," I said. Something crossed her face, not disbelief exactly, something quieter. A small hesitation, like she was reorganizing information she'd already filed away. She recovered quickly. "Of course you do," she said, but we both heard it. "I've spent 23 years in law enforcement. I've sat across from people who could look me in the eye and tell me something completely false without flinching. I've learned to trust patterns over impressions. Repetition over coincidence. Standing in that backyard with a glass of sweet tea warming in my hand, watching Margaret accept a compliment from my sister-in-law, I did something I almost never do at family gatherings. I paid attention, not to any one thing, just to the shape of the afternoon. to the way certain people talked to me directly and others seemed to address the space just past my shoulder, to the way Margaret's voice softened whenever my name came up, to the quiet, comfortable distance that had settled between me and a family I had spent 20 years trying to belong to. I thought about the recipe book on my kitchen shelf, the one Margaret gave me at our wedding, her handwriting on the inside cover. Every woman deserves recipes she can pass to her children someday. I had filled it carefully. Holiday meals and birthday dinners and ordinary Tuesday nights that I wanted to remember. I had believed for a long time that belonging to a family meant showing up. Standing there in Daniel's backyard, I began to wonder, for the very first time, if someone had quietly been suggesting otherwise. While I was still showing up, year after year, not knowing I'd already been written out. I didn't know yet what that meant. But I knew it wasn't a misunderstanding. I've interviewed hundreds of people in my career, witnesses, victims, people who thought they were helping, and people who were certain they weren't guilty. And the one thing I learned early, the thing no training manual teaches you, is that a lie rarely arrives alone. It travels with company. It borrows familiar language. It repeats itself in different mouths until it sounds like something everyone already knew. I didn't think about that on the drive home from Daniel's barbecue. I was thinking about potato salad and whether Ethan had remembered to grab the serving dish I'd left on the patio table. But something had followed me home, something quiet. It started the way most realizations do, not with a single dramatic moment, but with a collection of small ones I'd been storing without knowing it. A few days after the barbecue, I was at my desk finishing a report when a memory surfaced without invitation. Ethan's niece, Brooke, maybe 4 years ago, at Easter. She pulled me aside in Margaret's kitchen and said, almost shyly, "Aunt Jess, I didn't know you liked cooking. Grandma said you don't really like doing family stuff." I'd laughed it off. Kids repeat things incorrectly. I'd handed her a spoon and let her stir the sauce. I hadn't thought about it again until that afternoon. Then, another memory. Daniel's wife Linda, 2 Christmases ago, looking genuinely surprised when I arrived with a wrapped gift for each of the kids. "Oh, I didn't think you'd make it this year," she'd said, warmly, without a trace of unkindness, like she'd simply been told not to expect me. And then, Ethan's cousin Rick, at a birthday dinner 3 years back, he'd leaned over and said, "You know, you're not what I expected. Margaret, she always makes it sound like you're pretty hard to get to know." I'd smiled and changed the subject. I always change the subject. The thing about patterns is that they're invisible until you stop looking at the individual pieces and step back far enough to see the whole shape. Standing in my kitchen that Thursday evening, reheating leftovers while Ethan watched something in the other room, I finally stepped back. Different people, different years, different conversations, same words. She doesn't really enjoy being around the family. She's not easy to get to know. I didn't think she'd want to come. No one in the Reynolds family had ever been openly unkind to me. That was the thing that made it so difficult to name. There was never a confrontation I could point to, never a door slammed or an invitation rescinded or a cruel word spoken to my face. Just a quiet, consistent version of me that circulated through the family like a rumor no one remembered starting. I opened the cabinet and reached for a bowl, and my hand brushed the spine of the recipe book. I pulled it out without thinking, old habit, looking for something to make on the weekend. Inside the front cover, tucked between 2 pages, was a card I hadn't touched in a couple of years. Margaret's handwriting. My birthday, 2 years ago. "Thank you for always showing up for this family, even when nobody realizes how much you do. Ethan is lucky to have you." I read it twice, set it on the counter, put the recipe book away. I didn't know what to do with it. It didn't fit the shape of the thing I was beginning to see, and I wasn't ready to understand why. There's something families do that communities and workplaces almost never do. They inherit opinions. A grandmother decides something about a person, and slowly, without anyone noticing the transfer, that opinion becomes shared memory. Nobody formed it from their own experience. They simply received it, the way children receive table manners or holiday traditions. as something that was already true before they were old enough to question it. I thought about that for a long time. I thought about the people who had been kind to me, genuinely kind, while simultaneously holding a version of me that bore almost no resemblance to the woman who had been standing in front of them for 20 years. And I made a decision. Not an angry one, not a dramatic one. I decided I wasn't going to defend myself against stories I'd never heard. Instead, I was going to do the one thing I'd been trained to do every day of my professional life. I was going to find out whether what I was remembering was actually what had happened, not what I felt, what I could prove. I want to be honest about something. When I decided to start looking, I told myself I was simply verifying memories, that it was a rational thing to do, measured, professional. What I didn't admit, not even to myself at first, was that some part of me was still hoping I was wrong, because being wrong would have been easier. A misunderstanding is something you can apologize your way out of. A misunderstanding leaves the family intact. What I was beginning to suspect was something else entirely, and once I looked at it directly, I couldn't unsee it. I started the only way I know how, with what I could actually put my hands on. The first thing I pulled out was a storage box from the top shelf of the guest closet. It was one of those flat plastic ones people use for holiday cards and old photos. I'd been collecting printed photographs since before digital cameras took over everything, and somewhere in that box was nearly 2 decades of Reynolds family gatherings. I spread them across the dining room table on a Saturday morning when Ethan was out. I wasn't hiding what I was doing. I just knew that explaining it would require a conversation I wasn't ready to have yet. The photographs were undeniable. Every Thanksgiving, every Christmas, every birthday party I could find. There I was, sometimes in the background, sometimes mid-laugh, sometimes just a hand reaching across the frame to pass a dish to someone. In one from Daniel's 4th of July party, I was holding his youngest, who was maybe 18 months old, while his wife Linda arranged something on the picnic table behind me. In another, I was standing at Margaret's kitchen counter rolling out pie crust while everyone else sat in the living room. My hands were covered in flour. I was clearly in the middle of a conversation with someone off camera. I was smiling. I had been there. Every single year I had been there. I put the photographs aside and opened my phone. Our family group texts go back years. Most people never scroll that far, but I do. Occupational habit, I suppose. I found messages going back nearly a decade. Offers to host dinners. Offers to drive Margaret to her cardiologist when Ethan had a site visit. Responses to last-minute requests for someone to pick up more ice, more napkins, more folding chairs. Over and over, in timestamps that didn't lie. I cross-referenced some of them against the gatherings where Margaret had apparently told people I wasn't interested in being involved. The dates matched. The same weekend I'd driven 40 minutes to help set up for Daniel's anniversary dinner, Margaret had told Amanda I probably wouldn't want to make the trip. I sat with that for a few minutes before I kept going. Ethan keeps meticulous work calendars. He's a civil engineer, project timelines, site visits, contractor meetings. He's been using the same scheduling system for 12 years. I asked him, casually, one evening if I could look something up. He handed me his laptop without asking why. I wasn't looking for something in particular, but I found it anyway. There were at least a dozen occasions over the past several years when Margaret had told family members that Ethan and I had skipped gatherings because I didn't want to go. What his calendar showed was that Ethan had been out of state on construction projects. I had attended those gatherings alone. I had shown up without him, and Margaret had simply omitted that detail when she explained our absence to everyone else. I closed the laptop and set it back on the coffee table exactly where I'd found it. That evening, I went to the kitchen for a glass of water, and I noticed the recipe book still sitting out where I'd left it earlier in the week. I picked it up, opened it to the front, where the birthday card was still tucked between the pages. I read it again. Thank you for always showing up for this family, even when nobody realizes how much you do. Ethan is lucky to have you. The first time I'd found it, a few days earlier, it had confused me. It didn't seem to fit. Now, with the photographs still fanned across the dining room table and Ethan's calendar still open on the other screen, it fit perfectly. It just didn't fit the way Margaret intended. She had written that card because she knew it was true. She had watched me show up for 20 years. She had seen me cook and drive and remember and stay late and leave quietly and never once ask for acknowledgement. She knew exactly what I did for this family. And then she described someone else to everyone who asked. That was the moment the word misunderstanding stopped making sense to me. A misunderstanding is accidental. It happens when someone doesn't have enough information, or when communication breaks down, or when people are genuinely seeing the same thing differently. This wasn't any of those things. This was someone who possessed the truth, who had written it down in her own handwriting and tucked it into a birthday card, and then chose, conversation by conversation, year after year, to offer everyone around her a different version. I set the card back inside the book. I didn't feel angry. I felt something quieter than that. I felt certain. Amanda called me on a Tuesday evening. I almost didn't pick up. I was tired and I wasn't sure I was ready for a conversation that might require me to pretend everything was fine. But I answered. She didn't open with small talk. Amanda was never one for it when something was actually on her mind. "Jess," she said, "I've been thinking a lot since the barbecue. About what you said. About always being there." A pause. I went back through some of my old messages with Margaret, and I want you to know that I feel genuinely terrible. I told her she didn't have to feel that way. "I do, though," she said, "because I just believed her. I never thought to question it." She asked if she could share some of what she'd found. I told her yes. The messages she forwarded were spread across several years. Margaret's voice came through even in text, careful, concerned, always framed as worry rather than criticism. "Jessica really struggles with these big gatherings. I think she finds them overwhelming. And then, another year, I'm not sure she'll come," she mentioned to Ethan. "She finds family events exhausting." And another, poor Ethan. He wants her there, but she just doesn't enjoy it the way the rest of us do. Each one individually sounded like a woman looking out for a daughter-in-law who found crowds difficult. Assembled together, sent to different relatives in different years, they read like a carefully maintained story. "I'm sorry," Amanda said, when I'd been quiet for a moment. "You didn't know," I told her. And I meant it. But knowing didn't make it hurt less. I told Ethan that night, not everything at once. I didn't sit him down with a folder of printed evidence. I just told him what I'd been doing for the past few weeks, what I'd found in the photographs, the text threads, his calendars, what Amanda had shared. He was quiet for a long time. That's the thing about Ethan. He doesn't react immediately, he processes, which meant I sat across from him at the kitchen table and watched him replay 20 years of memories with a different understanding of what he'd been told versus what had actually happened. "The Thanksgiving I was in Houston," he finally said, not a question, more like something clicking into place. "I went alone," I said. "I sat next to your mother for 3 hours and helped her clean up after." He nodded slowly. "She told me you had seemed distant. Neither of us said anything after that for a while. I watched him try to reconcile 2 versions of the same years. The version he'd been given, where I kept a careful distance, where I tolerated the family without truly wanting to be part of it, and the version in his own calendar, his own inbox, his own memory, if he looked at it clearly enough." He reached across the table and put his hand over mine. He didn't apologize then. I think he was still finding his way toward understanding what he was even apologizing for. The hardest part wasn't the evidence. The hardest part was a thought that arrived quietly, somewhere around midnight, after Ethan had gone to bed and I was sitting alone in the kitchen. The family hadn't rejected me. They had rejected someone who didn't exist. For 20 years, I had shown up for birthdays and holidays and ordinary Saturday dinners. I had cooked and driven and remembered and stayed. And while I was doing all of that, a different version of me had been quietly circulating through conversations I was never part of. A version who found the family exhausting, who kept emotional distance by choice, who didn't really want to be there. That version had never cooked a single meal or stayed late to help with dishes or remembered a single birthday. But she had become, for a lot of people, the Jessica they thought they knew. I looked at the recipe book on the shelf, all those handwritten pages, holidays and Sunday dinners, and the names of people who had eaten at my table and gone home and told each other I wasn't really a warm person. The book had always been about belonging. I understood now that it had also been about proof, quiet, ordinary, handwritten proof that I had been present every single time someone decided I wasn't. There wasn't going to be another private conversation about this, not another patient explanation that went nowhere, not another year of hoping the family would eventually just see me for themselves. The truth had been sitting in photographs and text messages and birthday cards for decades. It was time to let it be seen. I've been in rooms where the truth finally came out. Interrogation rooms mostly, conference rooms, occasionally a hospital waiting area where someone finally said the thing they've been carrying for months. I've learned that truth rarely arrives the way people imagine it will. There's no dramatic music, nobody confesses with tears streaming down their face. Most of the time, the truth simply sits down at the table and waits for everyone to catch up to it. That's exactly how it happened in Daniel's backyard. It was the annual summer barbecue, children playing in the yard, someone manning the grill, the smell of charcoal and cut grass, and the particular sweetness of the lemonade Linda always made from scratch. I had driven there with a small accordion folder on the back seat. Ethan knew it was there. He hadn't asked me to reconsider. We sat through dinner. I helped clear plates. I laughed at someone's story about a road trip gone wrong. I drank sweet tea and watched the afternoon light move across Daniel's yard, the same light it had moved through every summer for 20 years. After dessert, Amanda stood and said a few words about family, about how grateful she was that everyone kept showing up year after year. She meant it warmly, the way Amanda always means things. Margaret smiled. She looked comfortable. She looked the way she always looked in a room full of people who loved her. Then she said, "It means so much, especially when you think about how hard these gatherings can be for some of us." A small pause, a familiar smile. Jessica has never really enjoyed them, but she comes anyway. That's something, I suppose. The table didn't react dramatically. A few people nodded. Someone looked at me with a kind of sympathetic expression. The way you look at someone who's making an effort. 20 people, all of them carrying some version of the same story. I set down my glass. "I'd like to understand something," I said. My voice was even, not cold, just steady. I reached down and picked up the accordion folder I brought inside after dinner, and I began placing things on the table. The photographs went down first. I didn't arrange them dramatically. I simply laid them out the way you'd spread cards. Thanksgiving, Christmas, birthday after birthday, graduation after graduation. Every gathering I could document. More than 30 photographs across 15 years. I said, "I want to make sure I'm not misremembering." Nobody spoke. Then the printed text messages, timestamps visible. My name, my words, offering to host, to drive, to help, to stay late, to come early. I placed them beside the photographs without explanation. Then 2 pages from Ethan's work calendar. The gatherings Margaret had described as events I'd refused to attend, dated alongside the out-of-town projects that had taken Ethan away. Side by side, factual, quiet. Then Amanda's forwarded messages, a small stack of them, the ones she'd sent me with her own apology attached. I placed them on the table and looked at Amanda briefly. She gave me a small nod. I watched people at the table begin to read. Slowly, the way you read something when you're not sure you're seeing it correctly. No one interrupted. No one needed to. Then I reached for the last thing in the folder, the birthday card. I held it for just a moment before setting it at the center of the table, open to Margaret's handwriting. "Thank you for always showing up for this family, even when nobody realizes how much you do. Ethan is lucky to have you." The silence that followed was a different kind of silence than the one before. Margaret looked at it from across the table. I watched her recognize her own handwriting. I watched her understand in real time what it meant to have those words sitting beside everything else. She didn't deny writing it. She didn't explain it. She picked it up, read it once, set it back down on the table gently, as if she were handling something fragile. And then she was very still. Across the room, Ethan looked at me. I didn't cry, I didn't smile, I just met his eyes. For the first time in 20 years, I didn't feel like I was standing at the edge of this family. I felt like I was standing in the middle of it, finally, at the exact center of the truth. Nobody made a speech. Daniel cleared his throat once and looked at his hands. Linda set down her fork very carefully. Amanda pressed her lips together and stared at the photographs. Margaret sat quietly. The confidence she'd carried into the room, that comfortable certainty she always wore in a crowd, had gone somewhere I couldn't see. She didn't look cruel in that moment. She looked exactly like what she was, a woman who had quietly believed her own version of events for so long that she'd forgotten the original. I understood that. I didn't forgive it immediately, but I understood it. I gathered the birthday card and placed it back in the folder. I didn't take the rest of the documents back. I left them on the table. Not as evidence in a case, just as what they were. Ordinary moments from an ordinary life, finally visible to the people who had been told to remember them differently. The afternoon continued. Someone refilled glasses. The children came back inside from the yard. The conversation that eventually resumed was slower, more careful, full of small pauses where thoughts were being quietly reorganized. I sat at that table and felt something I hadn't felt in a very long time inside this family. I felt like myself. And the question that hung in the air as people began gathering their things and saying quiet goodbyes wasn't whether the truth had been heard. It had been heard. The question now was what everyone was going to do with it. The weeks after that barbecue were quieter than I expected. Not empty, just quieter, like a room after a window has been opened. The same room, the same furniture, but the air inside it finally moving. Daniel called Ethan the following week. I don't know everything they said. Ethan gave me the short version afterward, sitting at the kitchen table with his hands wrapped around his coffee mug. He said he was sorry he never asked you directly. That was it. No speech, no lengthy explanation. Just a man who had sat across a table and seen something he couldn't unsee, finding the smallest honest way to say so. It was enough. Linda texted me on a Thursday afternoon. Just a few lines. She said she had noticed things over the years, small things, the kind that are easy to dismiss one at a time, and that she wished she had said something sooner. She ended with, "I'd like to actually get to know you, if you're open to it." I read that message twice. Then I typed back, "I'd like that too. Amanda, I already knew we'd always gotten along." But something shifted between us after that afternoon, a directness that hadn't been there before, an ease that came from no longer navigating around a story neither of us had written. She called me a few weeks later just to talk, not about the family, not about Margaret, just about ordinary things, her job, a book she was reading, a trip she was thinking about taking. I realized afterward that it was the first time someone in that family had called me simply because they wanted to. Margaret came to Thanksgiving. Of course she did. She wasn't going to stop coming to family gatherings any more than I was, and no one asked her to. That was never the point. She brought her pie. She hugged the grandchildren. She sat at the table and passed the rolls and told a story about something that had happened at her church bake sale, and people laughed, and the afternoon moved forward the way Thanksgiving afternoons do. But something had changed. I noticed it in the small adjustments. When she said something about me, even something harmless, people glanced in my direction now, not suspiciously. Just naturally. The way you look at a person when you've decided to know them for yourself instead of through someone else's description. She noticed it too. I watched her notice it. I didn't feel satisfied by that. I want to be honest about that. I had expected to feel something sharper, some quiet vindication. Instead, I mostly felt tired and a little sad and grateful for the sweet potato casserole Linda had brought that turned out to be genuinely excellent. Ethan apologized on a night in early December. We were doing the dishes after a quiet dinner, just the two of us, and he turned off the faucet and stood there for a moment before he said anything. "I kept asking you to trust time," he said. "I should have trusted you. That was all." I set down the dish I was drying and looked at him. 20 years of marriage. A man who genuinely loved me and had spent most of those years believing that keeping the peace was the same as keeping us safe. He had been wrong about that. He knew it now. And the knowing had cost him something. I could see it in the way he'd been moving through the past few months, quieter, more careful, replaying things. "I know," I said. I meant it simply, not as absolution, not as dismissal, just as truth. He nodded once, then he turned the faucet back on, and we finished the dishes. I started the cinnamon rolls the morning before Christmas, the way I do every year. It's a production. The dough has to be made the night before and left to rise overnight, and in the morning the kitchen smells like warm yeast and butter before anyone else is awake. I've made them every Christmas since Ethan and I got married. I don't think I've ever once been thanked for them specifically. They just appear, the way certain things do in a family, expected, relied upon, absorbed into tradition without anyone stopping to notice who made them. I didn't mind that anymore. I had the recipe book open on the counter, even though I don't need it for the cinnamon rolls. I know that recipe by heart. But I'd gotten into the habit of having it nearby, the way you keep something close that you finally understood the meaning of. I was rolling out the dough when the birthday card slipped from between the pages and landed on the counter. I'd put it back inside the book after the barbecue. Not as evidence, not as anything I needed to hold on to for protection. Just because it belonged there. It was part of the history, and the history was mine now. I looked at it for a moment. Margaret's handwriting. The words I'd read so many times they'd practically worn smooth. "Thank you for always showing up for this family, even when nobody realizes how much you do." Once, that card had felt like a contradiction. Proof of something painful. That she had known the truth and chosen a different story anyway. Now, it just felt like a piece of paper written by a complicated woman who had loved her son and feared losing him and handled that fear in ways that had caused real damage to real people. I understood her better than I wanted to. I placed the card back between the pages. Then I turned to a blank page near the back of the book, where I'd always meant to keep notes. Little records of who had been at dinner, what I'd made, anything worth remembering. I hadn't written in it in a long time. I picked up a pen and wrote the date. Then, underneath it, Christmas, cinnamon rolls. The kitchen quiet before everyone arrives, Ethan asleep upstairs. The year things became honest. I looked at it for a moment, then I closed the book. The recipe book had been a lot of things over the years. A wedding gift, a symbol of the family I'd hoped to belong to, a quiet place where I'd stored 20 years of holidays and ordinary Sundays. Evidence, briefly, of a truth that needed to be seen. Now, it was just mine. A record of a life I had actually lived. Not the life someone else had described. Not the version that had circulated through conversations I was never invited to. Not the woman who didn't enjoy being around the family, who kept her distance by choice, who was fine but not really warm. Just mine. The dough was ready. I started rolling it out, and the kitchen filled with the smell of butter and brown sugar and cinnamon, and somewhere upstairs I heard Ethan moving around, starting his morning. I thought about something a detective on my team had said to me once, years ago, after a case that had taken longer than it should have. The truth was always there, he'd said. We just had to wait until everyone was ready to look at it. I hadn't thought about that conversation in years. I pressed the filling into the dough and started rolling it closed, and I let the thought sit with me for a moment before I let it go. The truth had been there, in photographs, in text messages, in timestamps and calendars, and a handwritten card tucked into a recipe book on a kitchen shelf. It had been there the whole time. All it had needed was someone willing to set it gently on a table and let it speak for itself. I slid the pan into the oven, set the timer, and went to start the coffee. In an hour, the house would be full. There would be noise and wrapping paper, and someone inevitably burning the toast, and the particular, irreplaceable warmth of people who were finally, slowly, imperfectly, honestly, learning to know each other for themselves. I wasn't going to stand at the edge of that, not anymore.